First of all, welcome. It's so nice to be learning together. Look at this, on a Friday morning where there's so many things to be doing in the world and people come together to learn Torah. Amazing. Thank you everybody for joining. And the way this program is structured throughout the course of the next week is the same thing. We start off at the beginning with, we have Shachris at 8 o'clock, a little bit of time for breakfast, then we sit down and learn a little bit of Haggadah insights, take a short break, just in case everybody needs to catch up on email or calls, and then at 9:45 we have an in-depth Chabura on Pesach itself. Today the Chabura is going to be given by Rabbi Wittig. Rabbi Wittig gives a in-depth shir in our shul 3 times a week because we have an incredible group who are learning through Yoredah, the halachas of Yoredah, every 3 times a week in our base measure of Smichas Chaverim in the Ritz Kola, which is huge. I'm going to start off just today to thank our sponsors. Today we have, first of all, our corporate sponsor Bernath and Rosenberg, who are sponsoring the entire learning program. And today we thank Dr. Steve and Marjorie Kellner, who are sponsoring today's learning in honor of the Yortzeit of Marjorie's grandmother, Mrs. Ruth Goshberg, Rivka Bas Moshe HaLevi, and grandfather, Mr. Mo Goshberg, Moshe ben Avram Eliezer Ala Shalom, and they are no doubt getting a lot of nachas from the continued avodah of the family. It's very special, and especially if you see Rabbi Clemens, a special thank you to him, special thank you to Rabbi Ephraim Diamond, just putting a lot of effort into making our learning possible. So what we're going to do is we have a few moments just for Haggadah insights today. I'd like to unpack one, which is an unusual part of the seder, but most people are not aware. So how is the night of Pesach is called the seder? Seder literally means the order, right? So everything is well structured. But sometimes I find that people, especially younger people, find that it's not so orderly. They just find that it gets really long, and it goes on and on and on, and there's this and there's that we talk about, and it doesn't seem so organized. In fact, it is exceptionally organized. The Mishnah itself already tells us the structure. So going back 1800 years as to when it's redacted into the Mishnah itself, and clearly traditions which come from well before that, the Mishnah tells us very explicitly. It says the longest part of the seder, of course, is Magid. The Mishnah describes Magid. So it says Maz Gulai Kois Sheni. This is the Mishnah in Arvei Pesachim and Mishnah Dalet. The Kana Ben Shoel Aviv. And so then we have the questions, and we know that if a person doesn't have a child, then the father asks themselves, and the person asks themselves, and the Mishnah presents a number of questions. It's interesting that not all the questions in the Mishnah we use, and we have one extra which we insert ourselves. Okay. Then the Mishnah says, "Masil biganus Messiah b'shevach." We started with the difficult part, so we end off with the salvation. There's a dispute in the Gemara between Rabbi and Shmuel. What does that mean? Is that considered the physical servitude or the spiritual backwardness? We do both, so which is why we have the Manishan is followed by Avodah Mayenu, and then is followed by Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah. Those are both the Genus, whether it's physical or spiritual. That's Rav and Shmuel. So that's the beginning of our Haggadah. The inserts of the 4 sons and the inserts of Baruch HaMakom is all part of that continuation. Be it as it may, this is, some would argue, in fact, that the 4 sons is another manishtana to introduce the mitchila of the Avodah Zarah Yom Seder. Just interestingly enough, meaning there's 4 questions of the manishtana which lead to Avodah Mayenu. There's 4 questions of the 4 sons which lead to mitchila of the Avodah Zarah. So now you have the structure of 2 maschinim gnusas, two what are called lower level introductions of who we were, and now we're ready on the cusp of Messiah B'Shevach, right? So now we're going to talk about that. However, then the Mishnah goes on and says the Doresh me'arami Ovid Avi ad yigmor kol parsha kula, and you expound upon the parsha of Arami Ovid Avi until you finish the entire parsha, and then it goes on. At this point, Haggadah says, everybody, call everybody in. Right, to make sure that they're around for the part of the seder. Excellent. Okay. Here's an interesting thing. Essentially, that short line in the Mishnah accounts for everything else between Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah and Torah Gamliel. Right. So that's the major chunk. That's I guess the part most people get caught up in the Haggadah is Doresh Me'arami Avi Ad She'imor Kol Parsha Kula until you finish the parsha. So what's it referring to? So first of all, the word Doresh is an important word. We usually use the word drasha. We throw the word drasha around. Oh, the rabbi is giving a drasha. It has a very specific meaning. Doresh actually means to expound or unpack. It doesn't mean to say to tell a vort. That's not what it means. Doresh means to say is that we unpack it. So some Haggadahs, I like the Haggadahs actually with less explanation where you can kind of see this. So as an example, like in this Haggadah over here, this is the Wolf edition. This is Florence Wolf's husband's Haggadah, which is a beautiful Haggadah. So they have the pasuk at the top, and then the Doresh is they quote a phrase in the pasuk and explain it, a phrase in the pasuk and explain it, a phrase in the pasuk and explain it. That's called Doresh. Doresh means is that you're taking a larger entity from a pasuk and you're saying what do each of these things actually mean, expounding out. That's what Doresh means, and that's what goes through in all the. So if you go through the entire section over here, there's the pasuk, and then there's phrase expansions, phrase expansion. That is called drasha. In fact, the Arba Makos are really actually, if you were to, sort of in the way that my mind works, if you were to make a tree diagram, and it's one indent, one bullet point in of understanding the last pasuk, which was the pasuk of where HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it says as part of explaining what Moira Gadol is, tab, indent, right? And these are the 10 makos. I mean, the 10 makos and the dayenos are all one part, essentially, of that expansion. So it all fits into this. So, meaning, most of the Haggadah fits into that line of Dorish Berami Parsha, which is fascinating. But then the question becomes is, why? If you were the Baal Haggadah, if you were now dictating or editing what it looks like to make the Haggadah, and you wanted to talk about Exodus, then it's a strange place to go, if you think about it. Because if you wanted to talk about Exodus, you wanted to create the format, the structure, the curriculum for the annual recounting of this, I would have gone to Parashas, Shmois, Va'era, Boy, and Beshalach. That's where I would have gone. But instead we go to Arami Aved Avi. Arami Aved Avi has nothing to do with Exodus. Arami Aved Avi happens to be a section in the end of, or the middle section of the first aliyah of Parashas Ki Tavo in Sefer Devarim. And the topic over there is actually Mikra Bikurim. So we're talking about the farmer, and he's bringing the fruit, and he comes to the Beis Hamikdash, and as part of the template of what he says, he also mentions this sort of historical context till the point that he's holding these fruit in Jerusalem, and now he's giving them to the Kohen. Great, that's wonderful, but that really is, it seems to be like, you're going this way to be able. So there's a lot of explanations as to what it is. I'd like to expand a few options over here. Just to why will Chazal choose this, and why to be Doresh, meaning instead of being Doresh, just cut and paste from Parshas Va'era, and you have it explicitly without the drashas necessary. So that's the primary question. This essentially is the meat in the middle of our Haggadah, right? We've done two sets of questions and then Maskele Mignusas. We're about to do on Gamliel, but really the main part of the Haggadah is this, right? So that's the essential question. So there's a lot of reasons to think about. One basic reason is that you can't make everybody read 4 parashios at the seder. Meaning, as long as we think the seder is, it's just where do you start and where do you end, right? So meaning, if the Baal Haggadah were to go to Parshas Va'era, there's a lot there, but then what would you do? Would you make a laning? Would everybody do this? Would you go paragraph by paragraph? Like, how would that look? If there's too much, right? Sometimes when you're in the story, it's too complicated to tell the story. Does that make sense? You have to be able to be outside of the story to be able to tell the story. In fact, if you look at Parshas Mikra Bikurim, which is in Parshas Ki Tavo, one of the fascinating things about it, and I'm sure everybody's noticed this, is that each pasuk itself is another stage of the story, right? Meaning to say that if you focus in your Haggadah, I went to my Haggadah box today to find the old Art Scroll Children's Haggadah. Why? Because it colors each of the psukim in a different color, right? And the drashas are also in different colors, just very helpful for those who are oriented that way. But there are already 4 psukim we're quoting. That's all we're doing. We're quoting 4 psukim, and let's just quickly recap them. One is that's pasuk number 1, and that talks about immigration, right? That talks about being a foreigner. That's stage number 1. That is ger yezaracha, right? Then the next pasuk is pasuk number 2, which is affliction. In the Bris Ben Abasarim, right? So it's a completely different stage. The next one is we called out to Hashem, we prayed. And then the fourth pasuk is, right? So now we have redemption, miraculous redemption. Fantastic. Which means these are four distinct parts of the story which avail themselves to expansion. So it's much easier to tell a story when I have segmented chapters of that story rather than me trying to find my way to navigate through the story myself. So just in terms of structure, it is a perfect structure of this story which opens itself up. I hope everybody's noticing this, because if you're reading that God and you're just reading words, right, then it is monotonous. But if you realize that you just changed gears, you now have moved from foreign immigration to affliction, that's a different story. Right now we're at a different stage of the story. So this is number one. Number two, and this is what Shlomo was mentioning, I want to just expand upon this for a moment, is Arami Aviravi has a distinct advantage over Parshas Va'era and Ba, for a very simple reason, is that the people being talked to in the Torah are a different group of people, which means that the people in Parshas Va'era, the people who are experiencing the Exodus, the people in Parshas Ki Tavo never experienced the Exodus. They are a generation whose parents did, right? So they now are people who weren't there. They've heard the story, but they're recipients of it. And in fact, the actual parasha itself is intended for more people who are not there. Meaning, it's a projection about a mitzvah, about when people are going to be in the land of Israel, and they never heard this. They never, even their grandparents didn't. Now they're coming to Jerusalem, and they need to recount the Exodus story themselves through the Shmos, through the eyes of Mikra Bikurim, in which they are forced to say this template, which is fascinating. Which means, in a certain sense, we today in 5786 to 2026 are in fact closer to the people in Ki Tavo than we are to the people in Va'era. We weren't there, right? So we are recreating an experience which we are not party to, and we are doing it through the tradition of hearing what our parents said and continue that tradition, which means that actually Ki Tavo is more appropriate to the Haggadah audience than it is to than we would associate with those who actually experienced it. It's like that. It's like a parent or a grandparent trying to get their kids to appreciate the experiences and suffering they had. And the kids are like, when is the next iPad coming? Like that's kind of like the conversation is missing. We are that next generation. We need to try to figure it out through the prism of this farmer who actually didn't experience anything himself, right? So this is why it seems most appropriate to choose this parasha. But it goes further, because there's more than this as well. One interesting observation over here is which always struck me as strange, is the protagonist and antagonist in the story. Meaning, you could have just told the story in 4 psukim and described Israel went down, Israel was afflicted, Israel cried out, and Israel was saved miraculously. Those are the 4 stages, right? But instead of that, we have the beginning of the parasha, which is Arami, Aved, Avi. And everybody tries to ask, well, what does that mean? Who is Arami and who's Avi? Right? Now, it happens to be, if you go to the Torah and look at those psukim, there's a whole lot of explanations. The Baal HaGada actually leans in and decides who he's thinking about. But just understand that if you go to the Torah, there's many Mefarshim who disagree with the Baal HaGada, as an example, as to who this is. Maybe it's referring to Avram Avinu. Maybe Arami refers to Avram Avinu, and Avram Avinu was an Arami because he lived in Armenia, in Aram, which is in Mesopotamia. And Oved, he was journeying, right? And he was, so there's that, Ibn Ezra, if you want to read the Torah. But the Baal HaGada actually has one specific explanation, and it sets it up as 2 people, as we know very famously, Lavan and Yaakov. You say, why is that necessary? Why is that germane to the story? First of all, to that farmer who needs to breathe in Bikurim, and number 2 is for our purposes here in the Haggadah, because they always remain as protagonists. We have a little practice at our seder where we bought a number of different kinds of beards, and we nominate different family members to go out through the back door, knock on the front door with a different beard on, and they have to pretend to be somebody in the Haggadah, but they can't say who they are, right? So then what happens is that you have to ask questions, yes or no questions, or 5 yes or no questions to ask who they are, right? So we've had all kinds of interesting people. We've had the Shoichet, we've had Rabbi Akiva, we've had Rabban Gamliel come, we've had all kinds of people. So it happens to be that Lavan usually appears, but the white beard is the easy giveaway in this one. But Lavan is one of the protagonists, or he's the antagonist in the Haggadah. Why? It's so irrelevant. And in fact, the Haggadah makes an insinuation that he was worse than Paro, right? So why is that? Why is it so necessary? So it's interesting that Yaakov Avinu actually is called in Parshas Vayechi Misham Royeh Even Yisrael. Yaakov is called Even Yisrael, the rock of Israel. What does Even Yisrael mean? Rashi says it's a notrikon. Rashi says it is an acronym, it's a combination of two words, which is Av and Ben, right? Av and Ben is Even, which makes sense because Yaakov Avinu was the first of the patriarchs to actually have continuity into all their children, as opposed to Avram Avinu, who had a number of people who were kind of pushed out, right? Whether it's Yishmael or Bnei Keturah, and whether it's Yitzhak who pushed out Esav. Ultimately, Yaakov Avinu had what's called Mitasa Shlema. He had everybody in the fold, although it was very close. It was a very close race at a certain point where he thought it wasn't going to be such. But at the end of his life, he was able to say, Mishon Roy Even Yisrael. This is Even Yisrael, it's all complete. Av and Ben, the story does continue through the next generation, which is a very profound bar of success, which every parent fears. It's a terrifying thought as to, are we going to be able to achieve that for posterity? What's interesting is if that's the case, Yaakov represents the first person who's able to take the tradition of his parents and transmit it down to all of his children successfully. That's that whole episode the Gemara in Pesach describes around his deathbed, right? When he wanted to be Megala the Kates, he wanted to tell everybody the end. He wasn't able to. He said maybe there's a psula b'anai. What his concern was, maybe I didn't successfully accomplish the mission. When they responded, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that Kishem She'en B'libcha Ela Echad Kach En B'libenu Ela Echad, they're assuring him, no, we're on the same page. You have achieved your goal. That's a very profound. That's the most profound thing a parent can ever hear in their lives, is that we're on the same page as you. Very, very profound. That's what the Gemara Pesachim means, and that's why he responds, Baruch Shem Kaveh Malchus Zorah Lavoyet. Okay, be it as it may, if that's the case, this is the first person in history who successfully did what we're doing at the night of the seder, right? Meaning that's what we're trying. We're trying so desperately to use this moment where in the fragmented lives that we live, where everybody's everywhere and everybody's exposed to everything, to try to bring them back to the tradition that we have from our parents and our grandparents, and bring them back and connect them as to be part of the story, which was so much effort was invested in for us to be part of that chain, of the links to that chain. But if you think about that from that perspective, then taking this idea, Rabbi Elchanan Adler made this observation, which I think is a profound observation, is that if you think about Lavan then, the first time Lavan speaks in the Torah is in front of his father, right? Vayan Lavan Ubisuel in Parshat Ki Tavo, it describes how Eliezer, the Eved Avram, is making a proposition of marriage for the daughter, and in response answers the son and the father. And Rashi already points this out and says, you see over here, this boy doesn't have the right, not the right culture, right? He speaks in front of his father. It's not appropriate. He should wait for his father to say something, and then he can maybe say something afterwards. He can maybe augment, interject, define. But nonetheless, he speaks in front of his father. If you think about his name, if Yaakov is Av and Ben, then Lavan is Loiben, which would make sense, right? Meaning Lavan is a person who does not respect the process of continuity. He does not respect, like in the end of the day, Dad, you're antiquated, you're backwards. I know better, so I'll say what I think. When even if you don't know what to say, that's and then we have a society filled with such folks, right? And so in that case, where ageism, where you don't even think that experience is worth anything, and you're now have been educated at the age of 19 on TikTok, and you should know everything before these. That kind of culture is Lavan, lives in Lavan. At the Seder, what we're doing is we're setting up we'll almost call it archetypes of transmitters, two archetypes of people who live in society and live intergenerationally. One is called Yaakov, who despite much challenge was able to convey it to the next generation, and Lavan, who really wasn't interested in what those old doddery, previous generation didn't know anything to say about what was saying. And so we set them up as, so to speak, the protagonists and antagonists of the experience we're doing right now, which makes so much sense why we're specifically saying this as well. Two other observations. You'll notice, by the way, if you look in Parshat Ki Tavo, which is always a good place to start because that's where we're counting from, that's what the mission tells us, actually there are 5 psukim, but we only quote 4 psukim, right? It's an interesting point. If you go to, there's actually another stage. Go back to Parshat Ki Tavo, and after Vayotzei Hashem Elokeinu Mitzrayim B'yad Chazak V'Yisrael Netuya V'Gadol V'Osez U'Moisim, which is where that's the Esamakos live within that sort of fold of the pasuk. Then the next pasuk is right? Now the next pasuk is where he says then he says, and he has my basket. So I understand you could leave out the 6th pasuk. We don't need the basket in the seder, right? That's Mikra Bikurim. But the 5th pasuk should be, right? And so it's a little strange that if you're going to quote, Because if you look at the Mishnah says, "V'daresh mi arami aved avi ad sheyigmar kol haparsha kula." You finish the whole section, but we didn't finish the section, right? We ignored it. We actually ignored the end of the parsha. Why is that? So one of the interesting things you could notice is that maybe that in fact the Ar Haggadah was composed in the state of Galus, if you think about it. Yeah. Meaning every single person who's an author in Ar Haggadah is a person living outside of Israel, right? Or outside of Israel as a built Israel. Meaning, even if you think back to Rabban Gamliel, right? Rabban Gamliel is living after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, right? He's the Nasi, but he's well after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Some argue, I saw in the Kedah that, in fact, that some attribute the authorship of the Haggadah to Rabbi Akiva, fascinatingly enough. Just there's a lot of reasons as to why that is, but not for now. But Rabbi Akiva was living at the times of the Hadrianic persecutions in the 2nd century Common Era, 60 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Everything in the Haggadah speaks to an exile reality in a certain sense, which we could ask the question as to what would it have been before, and what parts would we have added or left out. The missionary gives us that intuition, and one of the questions would have been the Korban Pesach question, the Manishna, which we leave out, right? But be it as it may, it is clearly a reframing of this whole experience from the perspective of being outside, which is perhaps why it is that we leave out that 5th pasuk, which is the end of the story. Right? The end of the story is that 5th pasuk, which is Va'ata. And it is now you brought us to the land of flowing with milk and honey. We're not there. So we can't talk about that fifth pasuk, which of course matches. Jonathan Sachs has a beautiful essay in his Haggadah called "The Missing Fifth," where it's just the most profound observation of the entire Haggadah is that all the 4s are missing fifths. If you think about that, right? Meaning there are 4 questions in the Mishnah. The missing 5th question, which is in the Mishnah, is about the Korban Pesach, right? Which is when we're back in the Beis HaMikdash. There, when you think about the 4 cups of redemption, we are actually missing the 5th cup, which is Vehevesi, which is precisely that. Vehevesi is in fact the same words as this pasuk, which is Vayevienu Vehevesi, right? Is exactly the same thing. Vehevesi is the 5th lashon of Geula in Parshas Va'era, which we leave out because we're not there, right? Which is why there's no 5 cups of wine. There's only 4 cups of wine, reflecting those the 4 lashonos of Geula. And if you want to take one step further, there are 4 sons, right? If you read the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe has an unbelievable insight into the 4 sons, where he says that there are 4 generations of the exile experience. You know, from in the 1910s. Zayda comes from Europe. Zayda speaks Yiddish. He's a chacham. He knows what it's like. He feels Judaism in his bones. He comes to this new land, but he sends his kid to public school because he doesn't even have the capacity to afford anything else. Kid goes to public school, not interested in this. He speaks fluent English. He is only interested in one thing, and that is making it big to the suburbs. And that's what he does. He doesn't really care. He left the tefillin on the boat, not interested in much else. And that is the American. The orthodoxy is a minority of a minority of a minority of a minority in American Jewry. The majority of Jew Americans did this. And they left everything else behind, not interested in dad. Then you have like a kind of confused grandson, Tom, right? So the time is kind of like grandma is kind of lighting this candle business and dad is going out to work. It's confusing. Mazos, I'm not really, innocently aware of things. And then you have great-grandchild. Great-grandchild is Shannon Delishal, doesn't even know. But Judaism is bagels and lox, and that's kind of where we are, right? And then they start joining protests, right? But at this point in time, we're really no idea. And this was in the 1950s. Listen to this. In the 1950s, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, and there's the 5th son who's not even at the seder. That's what the Lubavitcher Rebbe said. Meaning, generation number 5, and that's why in all the tzivos Hashem and all the works the Lubavitcher Rebbe was to stop that process. Was the process of the 4 sons, the devolution of the process. That was what he was doing. Amazing to see that in the 1950s. I mean, we're living it now. That's where we are right now. To think about the amount of effort and money invested in any Kirov organization just to take one child and bring them back a few notches up the ladder. It's astronomical, right? But that's what he's stopping. So Rabbi Sachs observes that's the missing 5th over here as well, which means Arami Oved Avi is a perfect example of almost there. Meaning, looking backwards, we haven't made it to the next step, which is why it's so profound. Meaning, we should be reading the Haggadah and saying, wait a second, it's missing. And the answer is, yes, it's missing. There's so much missing in the Haggadah, which is that 5th and last step as well. Last observation, I think we have to close because of time. And that is a really fascinating observation. And that is that just in all fairness, is it true? Is it fair for what the Haggadah is saying? Because listen to what the Haggadah makes the accusation about. I like, again, you read Parshas Vayetze. I don't know, I missed that part. Yes, at the night he was chasing them, and Hashem sent to Malach and so on. But like, there's no, they weren't in bomb shelters, right? They didn't even realize what was going on. You know what I'm saying? And now it's Lakor Sakol. It's like it's sort of a near miss. I get it, but it wasn't. It's not. That's not the closest to death we've ever come as the Jewish people. So one interesting observation. I heard Rabbi Yaakov Giver make this observation, which I think is just a profound insight, and that is like this: when Yaakov gets married, what happens? He gets married to Rachel. It's not Rachel, right? And so then he comes to Lavan and he says, Dad, like what happened? He's like, oh, I didn't tell you the ancient practice. In our place, we don't marry off the younger ones before the older ones, and by the way, if you want to actually use the same language you used as to how Yaakov took the brachos, right? So obviously he's clearly reflecting on Yaakov, the younger one, taking the brachos from his older brother. Clearly, that's the language he's using, Tzira and Bechira, Bachor, right? Okay, but so now he's stuck. So he's married to Leah. Leah is a very wonderful person, but that wasn't who he chose to marry. So now he says, Maleh Shavua Azois, right? We'll finish Sheva Brachos. And then we're going to Mikan. By the way, the Gemara says, "And Simcha" from that pasuk. And then we go into we'll work another 7 years and marry Rachel. Fantastic. Happens to be as a function of that. Now Yaakov has a bunch of children. He has Reuven and Shimon and Levi and Yehuda. Right, and there's a break, and then there's and we have all these children. And finally, Rachel has a child, and his name is Yosef. And Yaakov loves Yosef. Mikol Bono, Ki Ben Zekunim Eloi, and the whole business. Think about this for a second. He always wanted to marry Rachel. This is the child he wanted all those years. It's not that he doesn't like, it's not that he dismisses, it's not that, God forbid, there's any animus towards other children, but this is who he wanted to marry. This is the child he so desperately wanted to have. And because of that, and the other brothers kind of get that. I mean, you can't fool children, right? And they sense that they're number 2 on the shelf, right? And so therefore there's this. We start by Parshas Vayeshev, and it all leads to what ultimately is Mechiras Yosef, and ultimately leads to Gishibud Mitzrayim. All of this started because Lavan mixed up the girls, right? This all started because of that marriage. Meaning all this hatred, all this internal combustion that was brewing was ultimately because of Lavan's decision to swindle Yaakov. And it speaks to a very sad point, which is that there are people on the outside of Klal Yisrael that cause us tremendous agitas, tremendous pain. But ultimately the pain they often cause is the pain that we have from each other. Think about that for a second. Most of the things that have led us into Golos, there has been an outside pretender, there has been somebody on the outside, but usually it's us killing ourselves, which actually catalyzed that process as well. Meaning, Lavan started it, but ultimately what he did was he created hatred internally, which led to the next stage, which is a terrifying idea, which is why, of course, Yosef is very much connected to the Haggadah, right? And the two dippings, the dippings of the coat of Yosef and the blood is the beginning and the end of the Golos. Those are the two dippings of the Karpas and the Maror. And this is going to be, that frames the entire seder, is the internal experience of Jews hating or disagreeing with Jews for legitimate reasons a lot of the time. But that also comes into over here. So the big is tremendous. So all we did is over here. We looked at one line in the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us that the reference point of the sandwich, what's in the center point of our Haggadah, is from Arami Ovir Avi. We looked at that and tried to expand why is it that this was chosen, whether it's an experience, whether it's an excellent summary, whether it is an experience of the outsider, the person who wasn't there, whether it's the idea of the protagonist or antagonist being the person who transmits or does not transmit from one generation to the other, the idea of this parsha being the ultimate, we'll call it curtailed or chopped parsha with a missing fifth piece of it, which is what the Haggadah is reflecting as a whole. And then finally this notion of understanding what the deviousness of Lavan was, the deviousness of mixing ourselves with ourselves. All of this is just from looking at one one on the Mishnah. I thank you everybody for coming. Please join us as we stay now, Be'ezra Hashem, in just a few minutes' time to hear our Willig who continues learning in such a profound level. I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Yeager and Dr. Weg, who usually are teaching at this time every single Friday in our Kollel Boker on Fridays, and you should come every Friday to continue learning. Thank you for giving up your slots this morning for our continued learning. Yashar Kach, everybody.
It's called Apple.
There we go, and this for the sake of practice.